He thought denying her a first-class seat would be a small moment of control, but in less than 10 minutes, it would cost him everything he had built. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The cabin of Flight 247 shimmered under soft amber lighting, the kind designed to whisper luxury without saying a word. Wide leather seats stretched in perfect rows, champagne glasses clinked quietly in practiced hands, and the faint scent of polished wood and citrus hung in the air. First class was not just a place, it was a statement, and everyone inside it knew exactly where they stood. Everyone except her. Evelyn Carter stepped onto the aircraft with calm, measured steps, her presence almost invisible against the backdrop of tailored suits and designer dresses. At 38, she carried herself with a quiet composure that didn't demand attention, yet somehow held it. Her light gray sweater was simple, her dark jeans unremarkable, her hair pulled back in a low, effortless knot. To the untrained eye, she didn't belong here. And that was exactly what they saw. A flight attendant near the entrance paused mid-greeting, her smile tightening just enough to reveal the shift. Her eyes flicked quickly from Evelyn's shoes to her seat number, then back again. A silent calculation, a subtle judgment. Just behind her, the flight manager, Daniel Brooks, adjusted his navy tie as he observed the interaction. He had built a career on precision, on reading people in seconds, on knowing exactly who deserved what level of service. And in that moment, he made a decision. Evelyn handed over her boarding pass without a word. Her expression was steady, her eyes calm, almost distant. The attendant scanned it, her brows knitting slightly before she leaned closer to Daniel. A whisper passed between them, soft but sharp. Daniel stepped forward, his posture straight, his tone polished. "Ma'am," he began, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I believe there may have been a mistake with your seat assignment." The surrounding passengers began to notice. A man in a tailored charcoal suit paused mid-sip of his drink. A woman across the aisle lowered her phone just enough to watch without being obvious. The air shifted, subtle but undeniable. Evelyn glanced briefly at the seat number on her ticket, then back at Daniel. "There's no mistake," she said quietly. Her voice wasn't defensive. It wasn't confrontational. It was certain. Daniel's smile tightened by a fraction. "First-class seating is reserved for our premium clients," he continued, his tone still smooth, but now carrying an edge of authority. "If you'd like, I can assist you in finding your correct section." A few passengers exchanged glances. Someone let out a soft, almost inaudible chuckle. The judgment had spread, unspoken but understood. Evelyn didn't react. Not to the tone, not to the eyes watching her. Not to the quiet humiliation settling over the moment like a thin layer of frost. She simply stood there, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady. For a second, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her to argue, to explain, to prove herself. But she didn't. Instead, she reached into her bag slowly, deliberately, and pulled out her phone. Her thumb moved once across the screen. A single message sent. Then she slipped the phone back, as if nothing had happened. Daniel exhaled softly, already turning slightly toward the aisle. In his mind, the situation was resolved. A minor disruption. A simple correction. He had no idea that in that quiet, almost invisible moment, everything had just begun to unravel. Daniel Brooks had already turned half away when something in the silence made him pause. It was not resistance. It was not embarrassment. It was something far more unsettling. Evelyn Carter did not move. She did not argue. She did not even look at him again. She simply stepped past him with quiet certainty and walked down the aisle toward the very seat he had just implied she did not deserve. The soft carpet absorbed the sound of her steps, but every eye in the cabin followed her. A man in the second row leaned slightly toward his companion, whispering under his breath. A woman across the aisle raised an eyebrow, her lips pressing into a thin, curious line. This was no longer just a misunderstanding. It had become a moment. Daniel felt it instantly. Moments like these could spread. Quickly. They could turn into complaints, into reports, into consequences. and he prided himself on control. He straightened his jacket and followed her down the aisle, his smile now tighter, his tone more deliberate. "Ma'am, I am going to have to insist," he said, his voice just loud enough to carry. The words landed carefully, designed to sound professional, but firm enough to re-establish authority. Evelyn reached her seat and placed her small carry-on bag neatly beside her. She ran her fingers lightly along the armrest, almost as if confirming something only she understood. Then she sat down, calm, unhurried, unbothered. The gesture itself was simple, but it carried a weight that shifted the atmosphere in an instant. Daniel stopped beside her, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "You are occupying a restricted seat," he continued, the edge now clearer in his voice. "If you do not comply, I will have to involve airport security." A ripple moved through the cabin. The word security had a way of doing that. It transformed curiosity into tension. People leaned in slightly, not wanting to miss what would happen next. Evelyn finally looked up at him. Her eyes were steady, unreadable, almost detached from the situation unfolding around her. "You can do whatever you think is necessary," she said softly. No challenge, no fear, just a simple statement. And somehow, that made it worse. Daniel felt a flicker of irritation rise beneath his polished exterior. He was used to reactions, confusion, apologies, even frustration. But not this. Not calm. Not silence that felt like control. He glanced toward the front of the cabin where another attendant was already watching, uncertain whether to step in. The situation was slipping, and he could feel it. "Very well," Daniel said, pulling out his device with a practiced motion. "We will resolve this properly." He turned slightly, signaling toward the door, already preparing to escalate. Behind him, the murmurs grew louder, though still carefully hushed. "I mean, look at her," someone whispered. "She must have boarded wrong. This is why they need stricter checks," another voice added quietly. The judgments layered over each other, building a quiet chorus of certainty. Evelyn heard them. Of course she did. But her expression did not change. Instead, she glanced briefly at the window beside her. Outside, the runway stretched wide under the afternoon sun, planes moving in precise patterns, each one following a system that left no room for error. Order, structure, control, the very things Daniel believed he was protecting. She folded her hands gently in her lap, her posture relaxed, as if she were simply waiting for something inevitable. And that was when the delay began. A subtle pause in the boarding process. A slight hesitation near the aircraft door. It was small enough that most passengers barely noticed. But Daniel did. His eyes flicked toward the entrance, irritation flashing again as he checked the time. Every second mattered. Every delay reflected on him. He took a step toward the aisle, ready to move forward with his decision, when the sound of hurried footsteps echoed faintly from the front of the plane. Not casual, not routine, urgent. The kind of movement that did not belong in a controlled environment like this. Daniel froze for just a fraction of a second. Something was off. And somewhere behind him, without looking, Evelyn Carter allowed herself the smallest, almost imperceptible breath, as if the moment she had been waiting for had finally arrived. The sound of those footsteps did not belong to routine service, and everyone felt it before they fully understood it. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, glasses hovered in the air, and even the low hum of the cabin seemed to fade as attention shifted toward the entrance. Daniel Brooks turned sharply, his professional composure tightening into something more alert, more cautious. 3 men stepped into the cabin in quick succession, each dressed in sharply tailored suits that spoke not just of wealth, but of authority. Their presence carried weight, the kind that did not need introduction. One of them scanned the cabin with focused urgency, his eyes moving past rows of passengers without hesitation, as if searching for something specific, or rather, someone. A flight attendant near the entrance straightened instantly, her posture changing in an almost reflexive response. "Sir, is there something I can assist you with?" she asked, her voice suddenly more careful, more respectful. The man did not answer immediately. His gaze had already locked onto something further down the aisle. Or someone. Daniel felt a flicker of unease settle in his chest as he followed the line of sight. It led directly to Evelyn Carter. For a brief second, confusion crossed his face. That made no sense. People like these did not come rushing onto planes for passengers like her. There had to be another explanation. The three men moved forward quickly, their polished shoes striking the floor with purpose. The quiet tension in the cabin deepened with every step they took. Passengers shifted slightly in their seats, some trying to appear uninterested while clearly watching everything unfold. Daniel stepped into the aisle, instinctively positioning himself as a barrier, his role demanding control even when the situation no longer felt entirely within his grasp. "Gentlemen," he began, his tone measured, "we are currently preparing for departure. If there is an issue, I would be happy to assist." The lead executive stopped just short of him, his expression composed but firm, the kind of calm that did not invite interruption. "We are aware," he replied, his voice low but carrying unmistakable authority. Then, without waiting for permission, he stepped past Daniel. The movement was subtle, but it said everything. Daniel's words, his position, his authority in this moment, none of it mattered anymore. The man continued down the aisle until he reached Evelyn's seat. And then something happened that no one in that cabin expected. He stopped, straightened, and his entire demeanor shifted. "Ma'am Carter," he said, his voice now carrying a tone of respect so clear it cut through the silence like a blade. "We have been trying to reach you." The words landed, and for a moment, time itself seemed to pause. The man standing beside him lowered his head slightly, as if acknowledging her presence. The third executive stepped closer, his posture mirroring the same quiet deference. Around them, the entire cabin froze. The same passengers who had whispered just moments ago now sat completely still, their expressions caught between disbelief and realization. Daniel stood several feet away, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The title, the tone, the recognition. It did not align with the image he had already decided upon. Evelyn looked up at them, her expression unchanged, calm as ever. "I was unavailable for a few minutes," she said simply. No apology, no explanation, just a statement of fact. The lead executive nodded immediately, as if that answer was more than sufficient. "Understood," he replied. Then, after a brief pause, he added, "We have been informed of the situation." That was when something shifted again. Not in Evelyn. In the room. The weight of those words settled over every person present, including Daniel. Because now, the question was no longer whether there had been a mistake. It was who had made it. And as the silence deepened, Daniel Brooks felt something unfamiliar begin to surface beneath his carefully maintained composure. Uncertainty. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, pressing against every person in that cabin, demanding an explanation that no one dared to voice first. Daniel Brooks felt it more than anyone. Just moments ago, he had been certain. Certain of his judgment. Certain of his authority. Certain of where Evelyn Carter belonged. Now, that certainty was slipping through his fingers, replaced by something far less comfortable. The lead executive turned slightly, his attention shifting toward Daniel, though his posture remained respectful toward Evelyn. "Would you care to explain what happened here?" he asked, his tone calm, but carrying a weight that made it impossible to ignore. It was not a question meant to gather information. It was a question that expected accountability. Daniel straightened instinctively, his training taking over even as unease settled deeper in his chest. "There appears to have been a discrepancy with seating verification," he began carefully, choosing each word with precision. "We were in the process of resolving it." The explanation sounded polished, controlled, exactly the kind of response he had given countless times before. But this time, it did not land the same way. The executive's expression did not change. If anything, it grew more still. "A discrepancy," he repeated quietly, as if testing the word itself. Then his gaze shifted briefly to Evelyn, almost as if seeking confirmation, not from a subordinate, but from someone whose perspective mattered more. Evelyn did not rush to speak. She simply looked at Daniel for a brief moment, her eyes steady, not accusatory, not emotional, just observant. It was the kind of look that reflected everything back without saying a word. And somehow, that silence carried more weight than any accusation could have. Daniel felt it. For the first time, the situation was no longer something he could control with procedure or tone. It had moved beyond that. Around them, the passengers remained perfectly still, their earlier assumptions now hanging in the air like something fragile and exposed. The whispers had stopped. The quiet confidence that once filled the room had dissolved into uncertainty. The executive turned fully now, his attention fixed on Daniel. Our understanding, he continued, his voice even, is that Ms. Carter was denied access to her assigned seat. The words were simple, but they struck with precision. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but for a brief second, nothing came out. Because now the facts sounded different when spoken aloud. Clearer, harder to adjust. We were verifying eligibility, he said finally, though the words lacked the same strength they had carried before. The second executive stepped forward slightly, his expression sharper. Eligibility, he repeated, his tone edged with disbelief. Based on what? That question did not have an easy answer. Because the truth was not procedural. It was not documented. It was not written anywhere in policy. It was a judgment, a quick decision made in seconds. And now, under the weight of the room, that decision no longer felt justified. Daniel hesitated, and in that hesitation, the entire cabin seemed to understand. Evelyn shifted slightly in her seat, not out of discomfort, but with the quiet awareness of someone who had seen this moment unfold many times before. Her hands remained folded, her posture relaxed, as if she were not at the center of it all, even though everything now revolved around her presence. The lead executive exhaled slowly, then turned back to Evelyn. His tone softened again, respectful, composed. "Ma'am, we sincerely apologize for the delay," he said. "Your time is valuable, and this should not have happened." The apology hung in the air, not just as a correction, but as a clear realignment of power. The room felt it instantly. The shift was undeniable. Evelyn nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement. No anger, no satisfaction, just acceptance. And that, more than anything else, unsettled Daniel further. Because there was no reaction he could respond to, no conflict he could manage. Just the quiet realization that everything he had assumed had been wrong. The second executive turned back toward Daniel, his voice calm but firm. "We will handle this from here." It was not a suggestion. It was a conclusion. And in that moment, Daniel Brooks understood something he had not anticipated when he first saw Evelyn Carter step onto the plane. This was never about a seat. And whatever was about to happen next, he was no longer in control of it. The words "we will handle this from here" did not echo loudly, but they settled into the cabin with a finality that no one could ignore. Daniel Brooks felt it immediately, like the ground beneath him had shifted just enough to throw off his balance. For years, he had operated in environments like this, where perception was everything and control was second nature. But now, control had quietly passed to someone else, and there was nothing he could do to reclaim it. The lead executive took a small step closer to Evelyn, lowering his voice slightly, though every person in the cabin still seemed to hear every word. "Ma'am, the board has been trying to reach you regarding the restructuring proposal," he said carefully. "We did not expect you to be traveling without notice." That single sentence changed everything, not just for Daniel, but for everyone listening. Board, proposal, reach you. The language was unmistakable. This was not a passenger being accommodated. This was someone being reported to. Someone whose decisions shaped outcomes far beyond this aircraft. Evelyn listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, her posture still composed. "I needed time to think," she replied simply. Her tone was calm, but it carried a quiet authority that no longer needed to be explained. The second executive nodded immediately. "Of course," he said. "We understand." There was no hesitation, no pushback, just agreement. The kind of agreement that only exists when the hierarchy is clear. Around them, the passengers who had once whispered now sat in complete silence, their earlier assumptions unraveling in real time. The man in the charcoal suit slowly set his glass down, his movements more careful now. The woman across the aisle avoided eye contact entirely, her attention suddenly fixed on nothing in particular. It was as if the entire cabin was recalibrating, adjusting to a reality they had not anticipated. Daniel stood frozen for a moment longer, his mind racing through the last few minutes, replaying every decision, every word, every glance. The certainty he had felt before now seemed distant, replaced by a growing awareness of something far more uncomfortable. He had not just misjudged a passenger. He had misjudged someone who held power far beyond his understanding. The third executive turned slightly, his gaze landing briefly on Daniel, not with anger, but with something more measured. Assessment. "We will ensure this matter is reviewed appropriately," he said, his tone neutral but deliberate. It was not a threat. It was not a warning. It was simply a statement of what would happen next. And somehow, that made it heavier. Daniel nodded once, the movement almost automatic, though it carried none of the confidence it once would have. "Understood," he replied quietly. The word felt different now, smaller. Evelyn shifted slightly in her seat, her attention returning to the executives. "Is there anything else?" she asked. No tension, no lingering emotion, just focus. The lead executive shook his head. "No, ma'am," he said. "Everything is prepared according to your directives." Directives? Another word that settled into the room with quiet force. Evelyn gave a small nod, then leaned back into her seat, her gaze drifting briefly toward the window once more. Outside, the runway stretched ahead, unchanged, indifferent to everything that had just occurred. Inside, however, nothing was the same. The power in the room had shifted completely, and everyone felt it. The lead executive stepped back slightly, giving her space, while the other two followed his lead. Their presence remained, but their posture now reflected deference rather than urgency. The situation had resolved itself, not through argument, not through confrontation, but through revelation. And in that revelation, everything had been made clear. Daniel remained where he stood, the weight of the moment settling fully now. There were no more words to say, no actions to take that could undo what had already happened. Only the quiet understanding that some mistakes do not need to be announced to be felt. And as the cabin slowly began to breathe again, one truth lingered in the air, undeniable and absolute. Respect is never assigned by appearance. And sometimes, the person you overlook is the one who decides everything. The cabin did not return to normal right away. It could not. Moments like that did not simply fade. They lingered, stretching themselves into the silence that followed. Even the usual background sounds felt muted, as if the aircraft itself understood that something significant had just unfolded. A flight attendant near the galley adjusted her posture again, this time more carefully, her movements slower, more deliberate. The same woman who had earlier hesitated now approached Evelyn with a completely different presence. "Ma'am, would you like anything before departure?" she asked, her voice softer, respectful in a way that was no longer performative. Evelyn turned her head slightly, meeting her gaze with the same calm composure she had carried from the beginning. "Just water, please," she replied. Simple, direct. The attendant nodded immediately, almost too quickly, and moved away with quiet urgency, as if even the smallest delay might matter. Daniel Brooks remained standing for a moment longer before stepping aside, giving space not just physically, but symbolically. His role in the situation had shifted, and he knew it. The authority he once projected now felt fragile, replaced by a growing awareness that control, once lost, does not easily return. He adjusted his tie again, though this time it was not about appearance. It was about grounding himself in something familiar. Around him, the passengers began to move again, but not in the same way as before. Conversations resumed in low tones, careful, measured. The earlier confidence, the subtle arrogance that had filled the first-class cabin, had been replaced by something quieter, something more aware. The man in the charcoal suit cleared his throat softly before looking down at his phone, avoiding any further attention. The woman across the aisle shifted in her seat, her earlier curiosity now replaced with discomfort. No one spoke about what had happened, but everyone carried it. The three executives remained near Evelyn, not hovering, but present. Their posture reflected attentiveness, a readiness to respond if needed, yet careful not to intrude. It was a balance that only existed when respect was genuine. The lead executive glanced briefly toward the front of the cabin, then back at Evelyn. "We have made the necessary adjustments to the schedule," he said quietly. "Your meeting will proceed as planned once you arrive." Evelyn gave a slight nod, acknowledging the information without further discussion. There was no need. The understanding between them was already clear. A few rows back, a passenger who had earlier whispered leaned subtly toward his companion again, but this time his voice carried a different tone. "I guess we got that wrong," he murmured. His companion did not respond, only giving a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the kind of quiet admission that required no elaboration. At the front of the cabin, the door closed with a soft but final sound. the signal for departure. The engines began their low, steady hum, building gradually as the aircraft prepared to move. The familiar process resumed, but the atmosphere remained changed. Daniel took a slow breath, his eyes briefly drifting toward Evelyn before quickly looking away. Not out of avoidance, but out of recognition. Some moments do not require acknowledgement to be understood. He turned and walked toward the front, his steps measured, his posture once again composed, though something within him had shifted. The lesson had already been delivered, not through confrontation, not through raised voices, but through a quiet reversal that left no room for misunderstanding. Evelyn sat back in her seat, the glass of water now resting lightly in her hand. She looked out the window as the aircraft began to taxi, the runway stretching ahead once more. To anyone watching, she appeared unchanged, calm, simple, unremarkable. And yet, everything around her had changed because of who she was. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane aligned for takeoff, and for a brief moment, the world outside blurred into motion. Inside, however, the silence returned one last time. Not heavy, not tense, but reflective, because in that quiet, every person present understood something they would not forget. Status can be worn, wealth can be displayed, but true power does not need to announce itself. It simply reveals itself at the right moment. And when it does, the room does not argue. It listens. The aircraft lifted smoothly into the sky, the steady force of takeoff pressing everyone gently into their seats. But inside the cabin, the real shift had already happened long before the wheels left the ground. As the city below shrank into patterns of light and steel, the tension that once filled the air had transformed into something quieter, something far more reflective. Evelyn Carter remained composed, her gaze fixed out the window as clouds drifted past in slow, effortless motion. To anyone observing from a distance, she was just another passenger enjoying a peaceful flight. But no one in that cabin saw her that way anymore. The illusion had been broken. A flight attendant approached again, this time with careful attention, placing a glass of water on Evelyn's tray with both hands, as if handling something delicate. "Please let me know if there is anything else you need," she said softly, her voice steady but respectful in a way that carried sincerity. Evelyn gave a small nod, her expression unchanged, acknowledging without drawing attention. A few seats away, the man in the charcoal suit shifted uncomfortably, finally gathering the courage to glance in her direction. His eyes lingered for just a moment before he quickly looked away, as if afraid of being noticed. The same man who had once whispered now sat in silence, his earlier confidence replaced by quiet humility. Across the aisle, the woman who had once observed with curiosity now seemed preoccupied, her attention fixed on her lap, avoiding any connection to the moment she had witnessed. It was not shame that filled the room. It was awareness, the kind that arrives quietly but stays with you long after the moment has passed. Near the front, Daniel Brooks stood beside the galley, his posture composed, his expression carefully neutral, but his thoughts far from settled. He had replayed the interaction more times than he could count in the short span of minutes since it happened. Every detail, every word, every assumption. It was not the outcome that stayed with him the most. It was the realization of how quickly he had decided who Evelyn Carter was without ever truly seeing her. He glanced briefly toward the first-class cabin again, his eyes finding her almost instinctively. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded anything. She had not corrected him when she had every right to. And yet, she had changed everything. That was the part he could not ignore. One of the executives approached him quietly, his presence calm but intentional. "Mr. Brooks," he said, his tone even, "I trust you understand the importance of discretion moving forward." Daniel nodded immediately, his response measured. "Of course," he replied. "This will be handled appropriately." The executive studied him for a brief moment, as if weighing the sincerity of his words, then gave a slight nod before stepping away. It was not a warning. It was a reminder, and Daniel understood it clearly. The aircraft leveled out as the seatbelt sign remained on, the soft chime signaling a return to routine, but the atmosphere had already settled into something different. The passengers no longer carried themselves with the same quiet superiority. Instead, there was a shared understanding, unspoken but present, that what they had witnessed was not just an unusual moment, but a lesson. Evelyn shifted slightly in her seat, adjusting the angle of her view as sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a soft glow across the cabin. Her reflection appeared faintly in the window, calm and steady, unchanged by everything that had unfolded. She had seen moments like this before. Different places, different people, the same assumptions, the same silence afterward, and always the same realization that followed. She did not need to prove who she was. The world revealed that for her. A few rows behind, a younger passenger leaned slightly forward, his voice barely above a whisper as he spoke to his companion. "You never really know, do you?" he said quietly. His companion shook her head slowly. "No," she replied. "You really do not." The words faded into the soft hum of the engines, but their meaning lingered. Because in that moment, high above the ground, surrounded by luxury and status, one simple truth had quietly settled into every corner of that cabin. The way you treat someone when you believe they have nothing says everything about you. And sometimes, the person you underestimate is the one who defines what happens next. Hours passed, but the weight of that moment refused to disappear. It did not matter that the flight had settled into smooth cruising altitude or that the cabin had returned to its quiet rhythm of soft conversations and clinking glassware. Something had changed, and everyone could feel it in the smallest details. The way voices stayed lower, the way eyes were more careful, the way no one assumed anything too quickly anymore. Evelyn Carter remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, composed and still, her presence no louder than a whisper, yet somehow the center of everything. A flight attendant approached once more, this time carrying a neatly arranged meal on fine china, each detail prepared with precision. "Ma'am, we have prepared something special for you," she said, her tone carrying genuine care rather than obligation. Evelyn glanced briefly at the tray, then up at the attendant. "Thank you," she replied softly. There was no sense of entitlement in her voice, no expectation, just quiet acknowledgement. The attendant smiled faintly before stepping away, her movements lighter now, as if the tension that once guided her actions had been replaced with something more thoughtful. A few seats behind, the same man who had once whispered leaned back slowly, exhaling as if releasing a realization he had been holding on to. He glanced forward again, this time not with curiosity, but with respect. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. Across the aisle, the woman who had avoided eye contact earlier finally allowed herself a brief glance toward Evelyn, her expression softer now, reflective rather than judgmental. No words were exchanged, but the shift was undeniable. Near the front of the cabin, Daniel Brooks stood with his hands loosely clasped in front of him, his posture steady, but his thoughts still unsettled. The routine of the flight continued around him, but his mind remained anchored to that moment when everything had changed. He had built his career on reading people quickly, on making decisions without hesitation, on trusting his instincts. And yet, in that one moment, those instincts had led him in the wrong direction. Not because he lacked experience, but because he had relied on something else. Assumption. He closed his eyes briefly, taking a slow breath, then opened them again, his gaze drifting once more toward Evelyn. She had not corrected him. She had not exposed him. She had simply allowed the truth to reveal itself. And somehow, that carried more weight than any confrontation ever could. One of the executives approached him again, his expression calm, his voice measured. "The report will reflect what happened," he said quietly. Daniel nodded once, his response immediate. "I understand." The executive studied him for a moment, then added, "What matters now is how you move forward." It was not a reprimand. It was an opportunity, and Daniel recognized it. The aircraft shifted slightly as it adjusted its course, the soft hum of the engines continuing its steady rhythm. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly, clouds forming slow, drifting patterns that seemed untouched by the tension below. Evelyn set her glass down gently, her gaze still directed outward, as if the world beyond the window held more interest than anything inside the cabin. For her, this moment was already passing. Another experience. Another reminder of how easily people draw conclusions without understanding the full picture. She had seen it before, and she would likely see it again. But she did not carry frustration with her. Only clarity. A young flight attendant paused briefly near her seat, hesitating before speaking. "Ma'am," she said softly, "I just wanted to say, I am sorry for how you were treated earlier." The words were simple, but they carried sincerity. Evelyn turned her head slightly, meeting her eyes. "Thank you," she replied. "Just remember it next time." There was no harshness in her voice, only quiet guidance. The attendant nodded, absorbing the meaning behind the words before stepping away. And that was when it settled fully. Not just in the crew, not just in Daniel, but in every person who had witnessed what happened. This was not about a mistake. It was about awareness. About the moment when perception meets reality, and the truth leaves no room for excuses. The cabin remained quiet, but it was no longer the same silence as before. It was deeper, more thoughtful, because somewhere between takeoff and cruising altitude, a lesson had been learned without being announced. And as the plane continued its path through the sky, one thing became undeniably clear. The way you see someone says more about you than it ever does about them. The aircraft began its descent as the city lights below slowly came back into view, stretching across the horizon like a quiet reminder that the world was still moving, unchanged by what had happened inside that cabin, yet somehow different for everyone who had witnessed it. The soft chimes sounded as the seatbelt sign illuminated once more, and passengers instinctively straightened in their seats, preparing for landing. But the real shift had already taken place long before the wheels would touch the ground. Evelyn Carter remained calm, her posture steady, her gaze drifting briefly from the window to the cabin around her, as if acknowledging the subtle transformation that had unfolded without a single raised voice. The same people who had once judged her now avoided meeting her eyes, not out of fear, but out of reflection. They had seen something they could not unsee. Daniel Brooks stood near the front, his hands resting lightly against the service counter, his expression composed but no longer untouched. He had spent the entire flight thinking, not about consequences, but about perspective. The difference between seeing and assuming, between reacting and understanding. And in that quiet space, he had come to a realization that no training manual had ever taught him. As the plane lowered further, the lead executive approached Evelyn one final time, his voice respectful, measured. "Your car will be waiting when we land, ma'am," he said. "Everything has been arranged." Evelyn gave a small nod, her acknowledgement simple, effortless. "Thank you," she replied. There was no need for anything more. The understanding between them had already been established. Around them, the cabin prepared for arrival, trays folded, conversations fading into silence, but the atmosphere remained thoughtful, as if everyone was carrying a piece of the same realization. The wheels touched the runway with a soft, steady impact, and the aircraft slowed gradually, returning from the sky to the ground. But for those inside, something had already landed long before that moment. Something deeper, something lasting. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Daniel took a slow breath and stepped forward, his posture steady, his voice calm as he approached Evelyn's seat. "Ma'am," he said, his tone sincere, no longer shaped by authority, but by understanding. "I owe you an apology." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Not because they were expected, but because they were genuine. Evelyn looked up at him, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady. She studied him for a brief moment, as if measuring not the words, but the intent behind them. Then she gave a small nod. "Just remember it," she said quietly. No lecture, no judgment, just a reminder. And somehow, that made it more powerful than anything else she could have said. Daniel nodded in return, accepting the meaning fully, knowing that this moment would stay with him far beyond this flight. The cabin door opened, and passengers began to stand, gathering their belongings. But the usual rush felt different. Slower, more deliberate. As Evelyn rose from her seat, the three executives immediately stepped aside, creating space, not out of obligation, but out of respect. She walked down the aisle with the same quiet confidence she had entered with, unchanged by everything that had happened, because she had never needed to change. The world around her had done that instead. And as she stepped off the aircraft, disappearing into the terminal beyond, the cabin remained still for just a moment longer, as if holding on to the lesson before letting it go. Because sometimes, the most powerful moments are not the loudest ones. They are the ones that unfold quietly, leaving behind a truth that cannot be ignored. And that day, every person on that flight learned something they would carry with them long after the journey ended. Respect is not given to those who appear powerful. It is revealed by how you treat those you believe are not. Respect is always revealed when you least expect it. If you believe in stories that uncover truth and dignity, hit like and subscribe because the next story might change the way you see the world. Thank you for watching.